Kate, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the Diet Starts Monday podcast. I really appreciate you giving us the time. I want to ask you something before we dive in.
Okay.
Are you a football fan?
Yes.
I saw FA Cup final on your Instagram story.
Yeah.
Are you a City or Crystal Palace fan?
Obviously a Crystal Palace
Oh,
fan.
amazing. Congratulations. That must have been epic.
Yeah.
Were you at the stadium?
Amazing. I wasn't, but everyone else in my family was, which was, big news in our household.
I mean, how many years has it been since Crystal Palace has won a trophy?
Well, they've never won the FA Cup before. So, yeah.
I mean, the crowd, there were tears. It was like unbelievable.
There were so many tears in my house, like in advance of, in preparation of, but yeah, the crowds are amazing. I mean,
Well, it's incredible coming from South Africa to see like the passion behind the football here and like how people really care about it.
Yeah.
And especially in the smaller teams. I went to a game in Fulham and I watched at Craven Cottage and I sat with the Fulham supporters and it was like immense. And we on these like seats that were built in like the 1900s. But then you go to Tottenham Stadium and it's like, it's this brand new, amazing stadium, but it doesn't really fit the people.
Yeah, no, Selhurst Park is a pretty magical place. The Eagles fans are very, very dedicated.
It was a big win.
Yes, big.
But anyway, let's get into it. I'm excited to talk to you today. I'm a little bit nervous, I got to be honest. It's not something I've done before.
Okay.
But I think what's going to be nice about this podcast is, I put a lot of work into really bringing our community and sort of demographic to the conversation because I think, we couldn't speak about everyone. And I think my community being around 65% aged between 26 to 35, I'd say, and 50% female male. I think, diving into that would be quite special for our listeners and really getting your view on what we're struggling with or things that we're thinking about or whatever it is at this moment. But why don't we start with a quick synopsis of you and sort of your growing up and how you got into your profession?
Yeah, how I got into my vocation, I think it's the question everyone wants to know. And I feel like I actually should have a more interesting answer for it. I think I was always, no one who knows me and knew me as a child or anything like that is, I think, surprised that I do some kind of work with psychology. I've always been asking questions and I want to know like why people are doing things and thinking things. And I've always been very interested, I think, in people, and then started studying psychology. And really it kind of came actually originally from studying kind of evolutionary psychology and that side of it. And that led me into the kind of psychosexual side quite academically, actually, at first. But I also had this real interest in why, when we started asking questions about sex or relationships or intimacy, why people suddenly kind of changed their position in their seats or their facial expressions changed or their voices changed. And it kind of spiraled from there. And I am really privileged to do the work that I do. I really love it. And I've just built on it from there. So initially I was a psychosexual therapist, which is the biggest body of my work. I'm also a separately qualified relationship therapist, psychosexologist. And then I launched my podcast in lockdown alongside millions of other people. And that kind of just built and kind of continued to build. And I started getting requests for specific episodes. And then the book was the kind of next stage of that. And the heart of my work is my therapy practice. It's always therapy first. And the book and the podcast essentially are that I believe that if we were having these conversations in a more mainstream, normalizing, accepting kind of better way, that a good chunk of people who are in my therapy room wouldn't need to be there. And so it's a kind of ironically, slightly like I'm trying to do myself out of a job.
Yeah.
But there's so much that we miss. And then therapy is a very exclusive way of getting it, which isn't accessible to lots of people. And so I guess my bit of trying to take it out is that it makes a lot of that information and those discussions more accessible.
And you spoke about how you sort of picked it up from people as you went throughout your career. If you go back to sort of schooling and education, was there anything that sparked that sort of interest there? Or did it come later?
It's just hardly any.
I mean,
like no, very little like formal kind of sex education. But I think everyone kind of starts to have their sexual experiences and they start learning and they think what that means or someone says something. And I think I've always been interested in kind of how it moves and how, the opinions that people have about what people do and what it means about them. And, we all have kind of our sexual experiences, both good and bad. But there was such a lack of anything kind of around it, any formal education or discussions or kind of places to ask questions. You know, there's so many questions when it comes to sex and nobody knows where to get them answered.
100%. One of the questions I asked my community was, do you feel that you had sufficient education at school? And 82% of them came back saying not at all.
I'm surprised it's not more,
Yeah.
to be honest.
I mean, that's so. Have you seen any sort of change for the better in terms of the education and the schooling? Because there's quite a lot of happening, call it in Hollywood, with like series like Sex Education, and the latest one that the names eluded me now, the 4-episode series. But that was more on social media, and that boy killed that girl.
Adolescents.
Yes, but there's a lot of pressure coming from society to sort of better the education for the younger generation.
Yeah, well, I think that also, I was at a launch event last week for a women's health initiative, and one of the big conversations was that a lot of people now, particularly like people in their early 20s and younger, are getting this health information from TikTok, through social media, and so, you know, with that is a increased access, which is amazing, but also comes a lot of misinformation.
Yeah.
And so what we have to combat is where the misinformation and the gaps are. Mm-hmm. And then that kind of comes down to us as experts and people who know what they're talking about and where the research is and where the data is. But that's the stuff that, you know, sometimes also isn't interesting, doesn't make good social media stories, doesn't make good content. But I think it is improving. You know, we're having conversations now about consent and about pleasure. You know, it was historically always very reproduction education and quite limited to that. Whereas what we know is that the reason that people have sex a lot of the time is not to reproduce. There's you know, hundreds of reasons why. But we're getting to that more nuanced conversations, and we have amazing sex education charities, places like Brooke, who are kind of trying to, again, change these conversations. But people have to want to meet it, and we have a lot of fear and shame around sex.
But I mean, that's sort of the older generation slightly than the younger kids. Like the age between 15 to 18, you know, it's very hard for them to come forward and speak to people about sex. And there was an article that I read that 30% of these children are going to social media to learn about sex more than going to a school teacher or someone in school.
I would say, I would be closer to like 90% than I would have said 30.
Yeah. That's interesting because, you know, it's becoming such a gap in education. And in my community, obviously, a lot of us are young parents. And I feel one of the biggest questions that we have is, you know, when does the parents have to step in and have these conversations?
Yeah.
Is it a lot earlier these days because the access to this misinformation for young children is a lot easier? And what would be your advice in terms of not specific age, but like when do we approach our children and have these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a parent myself, so I completely understand that. I think that, you know, one of the things that we also know, and like the research into these conversations, is the earlier the better, but in age-appropriate ways. And I think there's a real shift for parents kind of having to educate themselves, because we need to be prepared for the questions, to be able to answer them, but also we all want to be the safe person for our children, the person that our child comes to and says, I've got a question about this, or I saw this at school, or somebody said that, what does that mean? And ideally, as parents, we'd like to be the first port of call for getting those questions answered. And we don't always have to know what the answer is. But
could come back to them.
Yeah, what we can say is, do you know what? I'm not sure about that myself. Can I come back to you? Or can I like look it up this afternoon? And why don't we talk about it at dinner? But we haven't been taught as parents to know how to do that. Our parents didn't know how to do it. And so we then kind of have this big responsibility. And, you know, I talk about this stuff for a living, and I still get a bit panicked when the questions come, because we want to get it right. We feel this, and we really feel how important it is.
Yeah.
But what the research says is that talking to children about sex, again, in an age-appropriate way, our fear is that it sexualizes them, but actually we know it does the opposite. They feel more informed. They kind of often kind of delay first experiences. They feel more able to make choices for themselves, and they don't go and seek the information in an uncontrolled way. And so the thing that we can do, if we know, and there are great kind of charities, organizations, again, doing this now, kind of trying to help parents to feel more confident. But we have a little bit more control over what the narrative is, what the story is, what the kind of the questions we answer are.
Yeah, because it must be extremely difficult, especially when you go into all these alternative sexes, like, you know, queer sex or polyamorous, and all these difficult questions that we've been sort of not hidden from, but it hasn't. It's quite a new thing, a new generational thing, Gen Z and down, I would say. So to answer those questions, I can imagine are difficult, especially coming from a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old. If they've got cell phones and social media, they're seeing it a lot.
Well, it means they can get access to anything very quickly.
And the role model. So one of the topics I wanted to cover was sort of male role models and what, how rare that is in the sexual wellness space. Because I actually did some Googling, sort of just looking for, like a therapist like yourself, female. So why do you think there is that gap in sort of male role models in the space?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in general therapy, interestingly, kind of psychoanalysis is less kind of female dominated, and psychiatry less female dominated. But I would say therapy, counseling in general, is probably a bigger percentage of women than men. It's not exclusively a female industry, of course. But I think that, we've seen the kind of, I suppose, like the rise of female sexuality from the 60s to the invention of the pill, through to kind of now we've got like the next sexual revolution, if you want to think about it like that, the internet. But I think that also it's something which has kind of been like female sexual pleasure has been like reclaimed in a way. And I think that there has also been therefore a lot more kind of experts coming into the space, but perhaps also a bit of it being that kind of social thing of that women got a bit more comfortable having those conversations. And for men, I think that conversation is still behind. And I work with a sex toy brand called Lilo, and one of the kind of, I think it's something like the fourth, definitely in the top 10 of bestsellers, is a male sex toy for which they do no marketing.
What is the sex toy?
It's called the Hugo. It's either the Hugo or the Bruno. I can't remember which one. Okay. I think it's the Hugo. But there's no marketing done about it.
Yeah.
And we had a men's kind of sexual well-being event where we hosted it in a brewery. We were talking about kind of these sex toys, these new launches. And it was much more difficult to get a room of men together for a conversation about sex
100%
than it was to get a room of women together for a conversation about sex.
So why is that? Do you think that's just a historical masculine man thinking process?
Yeah, or maybe something about it still being very shame ridden. We see again like the sex toy market massively dominant in terms of products for women, that a lot of sex tech founders are women that we see. But also I think historically sex has always been more problematic, or at least socially considered to be more problematic for women, or trickier for women. Female orgasm has been has been pitched as more complex. We'll get onto it. It isn't. But that it's this idea that kind of, and also historically sex has been like much more kind of pitched as it's something for men. And so we are seeing, I guess, the rejig of that, or the rebalancing of the scales. And again, I think when there's a kind of female dominated, whether it's like market, or maybe it's more intimidating as a man to kind of come into that space. We have a few, Cam Fraser, David Chambers. We have definitely like a few men kind of starting to speak out a bit more, but it feels like it's not so, I don't know, so easy, maybe so fluid. Yeah, so approachable.
Yeah, because I can give my opinion. It would be tough for me to come to that event. And then you got to communicate with all these other men about, sexual. It's not, we always talk about boys' conversations, very short to the point. Like, I had sex last night. But a woman would probably go into a lot more detail and like dive into the different intricacies. So like, that's sort of the difficult space. We're quite direct.
I think a lot of people feel like if they also have sexual conversations that in some way they have to be sexualized, and that doesn't have to be the case. You can kind of talk about sex in a way that isn't sexualized, but it's the assumption is also...
What do you mean by sexualized?
That it becomes erotic in some way, or that it becomes
the
a kind of...
almost.
Having the conversation itself. But there's something also, I think, about this idea of admitting that we have a sexual problem, or admitting that we might need help. And this good at sex formula, which people feel like they have to follow or feel like exists in the first place, is hugely problematic, but it also puts a lot of this idea on men. And we're talking very genderedly here. We're not even kind of getting into people who are non-binary, gender fluid, but we see a lot of these messages about performance and that being a male-based sexual kind of experience or anxiety or pressure. And that if you haven't got that worked out, if you can't, again, perform, that therefore in some way you are failing in your masculinity at some way. And these are hugely, hugely problematic, detrimental messages, and we see them at both ends of the scale. And these are the things that bring people to my therapy room a lot, because it's not just I'm struggling with something, it's what does it mean that I am someone who is struggling with this? What does that mean about me?
And I can completely relate on a different note, because I went to therapy for anxiety, and it just helped me understand what I had so well, and I appreciate going so much. But to get me through the door, it was I have a problem, and I didn't want to have that problem. So it took me at least, I think, a month and a half to make that step. But it was so important because he was just teaching me what my body was basically and how my brain was working, and that it was okay. That was the biggest message. And I did it for 10 sessions, and, you know, I haven't struggled with that chronic anxiety again. You know, just understanding it and then living with it, you know what I mean? And I can imagine a lot of people in the sexual world must struggle with body dysmorphia, you know, thinking there's something wrong with them, whether it's downstairs or their performance. You know, it's just understanding that it's, like you say, it's not a performance metric.
But you just said you found it really hard to admit you had a problem, and it took you a month and a half to get in the door for generalized anxiety.
Yeah.
So consider sexual anxiety on top of that,
Yeah.
and what that delay looks like, what that pressure, you know, what that panic looks like. It's massive.
And I have a stat from my community, because I asked, would you be willing, or have you gone to sexual wellness or therapy? And 40% said no, they wouldn't be willing.
That
How
doesn't
interesting
surprise
is
me
that?
at all.
But why is that?
Because we fear it would be awkward. We fear it would be embarrassing. We fear it would be exposing, that we'd have to do something about it, what does it mean, again, for us to be a person with a sexual problem? Like, we fear these conversations around sex so much, and there's no escaping them in a psychosexual therapy room. And, you know, one of the first questions I ask everyone who comes for a session with me, I'm like, okay, why now? What was the trigger for the inquiry, for the email? What changed? Because you don't get change without motivation, and that's what typically happens, is these problems kind of roll on or rumble on for a while, and then something changes and people are like, oh, I need to deal with this now.
Now, yeah. Well, yeah. It's like when you have a health problem and you get admitted to the hospital, now you have to deal with your blood pressure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's and you know, we see this avoidance and delay with everything from smear tests to problems with genitals to anything basically in the pelvic region, anything kind of to do with like the anus, like basically because people have this fear and embarrassment about these parts of their bodies and what they're associated with, they delay seeking help for symptoms. And, you know, I do a lot with kind of like about like gynecological cancers and things like that, because these avoidance of symptoms, avoidance of going to see the doctor about something, of saying like I've got a bit of a lump or I've got pain, or has potentially, you know, life-changing qualities to it. But again, we feel embarrassed because it's on our genitals and not on our knee or on our arm, or we don't seek help in the same way.
And it's, I mean, only one or two people are going to see it or experience that with you. You know, if you go to therapy, it's, you know, you're only going to be speaking to one person. It's not like the whole world's going to find out your secret, which is also interesting. I mean, I find it crazy that society has just immensely put pressure on people to hide in a cage and not be free with their bodies and like love who they are. And I had a podcast with the CrossFit nurse, and she said it so well. We have the audacity to not like X about myself or Y about myself, and she said it's so lovely. But like, people are just pressured from everyone else about what they look like, and we should be able to walk the streets with no clothes on and just be sort of free, you know.
We get arrested for that. But
yeah. Not in the old days, but you know what I mean. Like, just love who you are, and not, you know.
Well, we're so preoccupied also with shoulds and what we think we should be doing and what we think we should look like and how we should be and what our bodies should be doing and the level to which we should be performing, and a lot of that gets caught up with sex. But it's not just sex, you know. For me, we're dealing with like the physical aspects of sex, and psychosexual therapy is only a talking therapy. There's nothing physical kind of happening in the room, but the majority of my work is with people's thoughts and feelings about sex. It's unpacking, okay, where did you learn that? What do you think the function was of that was? Is that a useful thing for you to hold on to? Why do you feel like that? Where did you get that piece of feedback from? What is it that's getting in the way of you enjoying this.
What's the most common answer there?
Oh my gosh, what's the most common answer? I think mostly people have a sense of shame, but they can't necessarily always identify where it came from, unless it was very kind of early or deep-rooted. But typically, it's kind of a collection of lots of things. Like, oh, someone in the playground told me that the first time I had sex, I would bleed everywhere and it would really hurt. And that had happened to their older brother or older sister. Or, and then, sex came on the TV at home and mum turned off the TV immediately. Or everyone got really twitchy. Or dad found a condom like under my bed and went absolutely nuts. Or I got some girl at school, like there was a lot of commentary because her skirt was too short. Or, it's just all of these kind of messages, like, and particularly things about how much sex we should have, how little sex we should have, what that looks like, what's a good amount of sex, and then also how do we maintain it? How do we say sexually interesting to people? And there's so much in the unsaid, which I think is super important, which is, okay, well, what did we not hear about? We didn't hear that sex is a thing that people do when they're attracted to each other and they enjoy, and providing it's legal, consensual, adult, that's an okay thing for them to do. That people can have sex for a variety of reasons, that it can feel good in different ways on different days of the week. And again, this is much more like adult conversations than those, as we said, conversations which are for children, which are age appropriate. And I'm not a sex educator and I don't work with young people, but I do work with lots of parents who have lots of anxiety and also say, oh, I want to make sure I don't make these mistakes for my kids. I want to make sure that I feel more comfortable because I don't think I know how to do this.
Yeah, and if you understand it better, you'll be able to portray it better to your children.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, talking about how many times you have sex, and we can that's a good segue into the next topic that I wanted to cover, is just relationships in general. And I spoke to my community again, and it was quite a good result in terms of how many times they're having sex. It was about 40% said 2 to 3 times a week, 25% 2 to 3 times a month. And then I kind of made the third, it varies between both, because I think that's a common, in relationships to have a month where there's a little bit more than another. That was another 25%, and it was like 1%, 10 or less a year. Which in your book it said that's sort of like a sexless relationship, to have it less than 10 in 1 year. So I thought those were pretty good stats. But my next question was, are you happy with your answer that you just provided?
Okay.
And 65% said yes, 35% said no. So that's really where it's interesting. Because I'll talk personally, I'm happy with how much sex that we're having. It's not a lot, it's the perfect amount for us. And if we're happy with that, then there's no real issues. But if people aren't happy, how important is it to have that conversation with your partner?
Yeah, it's really important. And one of the things that I'm, being an annoying therapist, is interesting. You said, oh, I thought those stats were really good.
Yeah.
Which indicates to me that you have an idea about like what a regular amount of sex would be. And I think that, again, I was like, oh, that's interesting that you have an idea of what you have an idea automatically of what you think good is.
Yeah.
And which is great if you feel like your idea of what good is aligned with the kind of level of sex that you're having or regularity of sex that you're having. Now, regularity of sex tells us nothing about quality of sex. And that's a really important point to make, because something I often talk about is how we are trying to objectively measure a subjective experience. And the only way that we really have of people measuring, like if they think they're having a good amount of sex, is by literally just the metrics of it, like the number, once a week. And it's, like you say, it's the right amount for us. Now, that is the thing that I love to hear from people. I'm like, great. So there's no conflict between where we're at and where we think we should be at.
Yeah.
And the should is the killer here. The expectations, and again, that idea of metacognition, we think about our thoughts. Is that a good amount? What would it mean? Does that mean we're normal? Like this, again, what is everyone else doing? Do we think that we're as good as everyone else? Like, what does that mean? Is that a good thing for our relationship? Is the amount of sex we have indicative of how well our relationship's going? All of these questions that we have for ourselves all the time. But yeah, if it's a problem in your relationship, you shouldn't fear the conversation. Of course, it might be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I work with lots of people who've been together for like 10 years and they've never spoken about sex until they have to. And then when they have to, they don't have the tools to know how to do it. They don't know how to start it. They fear what their partner's going to think. They are worried their partner is going to have questions or think that they're saying that they're doing a bad job.
So I'm in that pool, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that we don't often speak about our sexual desires.
Mm-hmm.
And I fear that when it comes to having sex after the conversation, that's going to play on my mind.
Okay.
And the answers will play on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then it will affect the sex, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's so common.
Yeah.
Because this is the thing, we get so in our heads
100%.
and so preoccupied. And again, what it boils down to, it's this idea of like that good at sex is a magic formula that we can learn, and once we learnt it, we've got it, and it's secure, and that's that job done. Whereas actually I would argue that good at sex is about kind of communication, consent, knowing your body, and why are we having it?
I want to just ask on consent. What do you mean by consent? Because if you're in a relationship, is it just getting consent like every time? Or
well, consent is an ongoing conversation. It's not kind of that we say yes once. No one should be having sex when they don't want to have sex.
Right, yeah.
But
even in a relationship. So I've actually heard that before. Like if someone, like say the partner comes home after a night out and your partner doesn't want to have sex, but like you kind of force it on a little bit. Is that sort of the moments that you're talking about?
Yeah, well also the word force.
Yeah.
You just use there as kind of indicative of...
I don't mean it like that heavily, but yeah.
But it's, and again, a lot of it comes into this idea that, we owe our partners sex. And what I'm not saying is that, like, there might be some times that we think, oh, I'm less in the mood, but you know what, like, the kids are asleep, or, like, we've got time, or whatever, and we get into the experience. It's not everyone starts sexual experiences from, like, I want to have sex now. That isn't the starting place. A lot of people have what we call responsive desire, which is that they get into it. It's kind of starting something means that it triggers the desire to continue. It's this idea that we can have, and again, this is about the variety of whys, but consent is an ongoing conversation. It looks different. It's checking in. It can also be withdrawn at any time. But a lot of us, I mean, I didn't grow up with any conversations about consent, really. I don't know if you did.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hugely, hugely important. But a lot of the messages that we got were like, if you start something with someone and you decide you're not enjoying it or you don't want to carry on or whatever, you just have to finish the situation. You just have to get on with it. There was no, we weren't empowered to say no.
Yeah.
Or stop, or can we change this? And couples shouldn't fear the conversations, because otherwise you're only working with your version of what you think is going on in your partner's head, and your partner can only work with their version of what they think is going on in your head. And so we're operating with this assumptions all the time. Like, I think it's going well, because, and this is where kind of good at sex can change. We used to have sex like this all the time, and it used to work, so we'll just carry on doing it. Whereas we kind of fear if we say to our partner, like, is that still working for you? Or does that still feel good? Or shall we try something different?
Yeah.
That
now what you were doing seems wrong.
Yeah. Or that if we change something, they're going to judge us.
Yeah.
Or in us saying something, they are going to think that it's not good. Or we don't treat sex as this kind of adaptable part of our lives, or this kind of ever-moving, fluid kind of force.
So creativity is quite important. And I think I remember you saying that change one thing every time. That's quite good advice.
Yeah.
I think if I quote one of the questions that I got, they asked how we've gone from hot, steamy, 3 times a day sex to a few times a month. What would your advice be to sort of ignite the fire? It's like, that would probably be it. I don't know.
I would say that's totally expected. We know that sex changes. We know that at the start of relationships, everything in your brain and your body is also working with you. We are wired to enjoy novelty, to get to know people, to explore, when we don't know someone, everything's new and it's exciting. We are like chemically also driven at the start of relationships for kind of to be more sexually interested, to kind of get connected to that person, to build these relationships. And we habituate, which, like we do everything in life, we learn what to expect, we know how it works, and the kind of, the high like starts to peter off. It doesn't mean that the sex quality reduces. It doesn't mean that we are enjoying what we're doing less. It just means that it's going through a change. But if we talk about, Esther Perel, who's an absolute kind of icon in my world, she would talk about this kind of exchange of the kind of nurturing, the safety, the security of relationships, the known, and then the kind of novelty of the erotic, the kind of new, the exciting, and how these two things they kind of do this.
Yeah.
And so therefore we have to work on how we inject the erotic, the new, the excitement, the desiring. But what we fear so much is when it changes.
Yeah.
And we then think, oh, the problem's with me or the problem's with us. And that starts to put a whole negative
spin
slant
on the relationship.
on it. Yeah.
Because I definitely relate to what you're saying there. I find so many pleasures in other parts of the relationship where the sex hasn't become the main driver, where it definitely was initially. Like you say, you're getting to know your partner, you're having fun. But now, just being with them, going out for dinners, like doing stuff together, those are pleasures that sort of tick the box for me personally, without having the whole sex story.
It's a different phase of your relationship and a different stage. But also, at the start of our relationships, we throw everything into getting to know that person. We see our friends less, we're less focused at work, we're often probably more late. Like we prioritize, that person. And we are throwing ourselves in, often at the expense of many other things in our lives. No, we cannot continue to do that forever. We have like jobs to get to, classes to get to, bills to pay, friends to see, family to visit. We have to then navigate that relationship in our life. But once we get used to that person, we also deprioritize them slightly, and we have to remember in relationships to look after the person who's in front of us all the time, because just because they're there all the time doesn't mean that that's quality time. But you look at now, you use the example of young, like parents with young children at the moment, how much people are juggling between work. Most people are two-parent working households now, young kids, and this 9-to-5 model has dissolved. We're all on our phones, we're being notified all the time, we're always distracted, and it eats in, our outside lives. It used to be quite divided. It used to be kind of like leave the house, commute, go to work, 5 o'clock, shut the door, commute home, get home, with some kind of, flurries of difference. But there was some, it used to be more regimented, this kind of the boundaries between all of these things. And now it's much, much blurrier.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I asked that question about sexual satisfaction, and I gave the options of stress, time, communication, and communication was 44%. So they weren't blaming stress and time as much as communication. And then I asked, how often are you doing it? And the answers were not very often. So how do we know the answer is communication? What is stopping us still from having the conversations?
Well, we don't know how to. We don't see it. We didn't see it modeled for a start. We haven't. I don't know where this phrase come from, and I need to. But someone said to me, it's like if you grow up in a house speaking Spanish, you kind of learn how to speak Spanish, and I guess we don't see that kind of modeling of these conversations about sex and about relationships. We don't see them happening. We only see the kind of Hollywood glamorized versions. And we don't see the normality of sex, the fact that it can have good days, bad days, average days, that sometimes it doesn't go perfectly, that sometimes the doorbell goes in the middle, or the baby cries, or the dog jumps on the bed, or whatever it is, or you get cramp, or it's not, you need to use lube, or, it's... We don't see that. We have these kind of polarized versions, which are the kind of Hollywood glamorous, like perfect. Everyone orgasms simultaneously, very quickly. There's no like sweat, no like bad positions. It never goes wrong. And by comparison, if that's the only version that we have, we then think, oh, well, the sex we have never looks like that. Like, what are we doing so wrong? Or we try and replicate it, and we realize that, it was not as easy as it appeared anyway.
So what would be your advice be in where do we look if we're trying to get some of that information?
I think the first thing we have to do is introduce the topic with our partners. And if you want to talk to your partner about sex, tee it up, but not at a time that you're just about to have sex, just had sex, or are having sex. So
During
take it,
sex, that'd be tough.
take it out, take it out of it. Not like stopping mid-sex and be like, shall we talk about what we're doing?
Right. Yeah.
Take it out of a sexual context.
Yeah.
And approach it with your partner in a positive way, which is, do you know what I've been thinking about the fact that we never talk about our sex life and we talk about everything else. I'm wondering where that is, or do you think that we should try and do that? And if you've been thinking about it for a while, give them a chance to catch up with you, because you've already worked it out in your head and you're landing it on them. They might not be in the same place. And because we fear these conversations, their instant reaction might be, oh my God, what's wrong?
Oh, that's some good advice.
And the other thing that you can do is, I often talk about them as L-shaped conversations. Send them an article or a podcast or something like that and say, I read this today. What do you think about that? Or I had to listen to this. I thought it was really interesting. Maybe we can talk about it.
That's interesting, because I think about it. The first thing I thought when you said that was breakups, because people that break up with someone, they're 6 months ahead in their mind. And then when you break up with someone, it's fresh for them. So they hurt 6 months later. And that's the same thing with that conversation that you were saying. You've been thinking about it. So when you bring it up, give them time.
We've been taught that having to talk about sex is only something that people do when there's a problem.
Yeah.
And so if you've never talked about it and you've been together for like 3 years and your partner says, I think we need to talk about sex, your natural reaction is, why? Yeah, exactly that. Why? Why do we need to talk about it? We've never talked about it before. Everything's been fine. And suddenly you start spiraling.
Yeah.
And we all have the story of like the couple who broke up because they weren't having sex, or like because of this. And so that's where we're going to go to. And what we need to do is we need to take it down a level and take the heat out of it. Because sometimes it's like, do you know what? We have been doing the same thing for a while. Maybe we should try something different. How about X? Would you like to do that? And if they go, absolutely not, no. But I would be quite interested in doing this other thing. And you say, great, that sounds kind of cool to me. Why don't we work that out? We innovate every area of our lives, our gym classes, our workout routines, how we travel, our commutes, our work lives. We're constantly innovating, and then we expect our sex lives and relationships to be completely protected, that we think if we're working at them that must be a bad thing, or that we don't need to change things or review things or work things out. And again, to quote Esther Perel, she says, we're in like multiple marriages with the same, she uses the word marriages, but it doesn't have to be a marriage, of course, but multiple marriages with the same person. And it's this kind of adapt and review, what's working, what's not. Yeah. Like, how do we change something, do something different?
I think I saw that on your Instagram the other day. Yeah. That's interesting. So you mentioned, gym classes and stuff, and that just took me, because Diet Sauce Monday, it's quite a motivational podcast. We're trying to get people to move and stuff. How important is your sort of mental and physical health? Can that be quite a big benefit to your sexual wellness?
Yeah, definitely. Like, if you are not feeling good in yourself, it's unlikely you're going to feel great about yourself during sex or in a sexual space.
So I actually put my answer as not body dysmorphia, it was just body, worried about your body. I feel like I have better sex if I'm in better shape. Mm-hmm. It's just a mental, and also if you clean, like room, shower, like I'm in a much better mental place than I am if I haven't, over a couple of weeks. And then you start to worry about how you look in their eyes. It's quite an interesting thing.
Body confidence.
Yeah. Body confidence, that's the one.
Body confidence and body insecurities play a huge role in sex. And there is the more specific part of it, which is like fears about your genitals, like anxiety, like does my vulva look normal? Is my penis the right size? Like, do I like, what if someone kind of goes down on me? Like, would I taste okay? Does I smell okay? Like, all of that stuff is in our heads all the time. I have to be a certain way. What if I haven't shaved? What if I have body hair? What if they think I look strange down there? What if they think that they put their hands on my stomach and it, I think that I don't like it, so they're not going to like it. And those massively, massively play on our minds. And how we feel about our bodies, it's then kind of exemplified during sex, because there's nowhere to hide. All the strategies that we might normally use in the rest of our lives aren't there. We can't physically hide. We kind of can't psychologically hide. It's quite exposing. Yeah. And then we're really distracted by the thoughts because we're having all these questions. And if that's how we feel about ourselves, then the other person just kind of becomes a mirror for that. It doesn't actually really matter what they're thinking, because we think that they're thinking it anyway. Yeah. We've already decided that that's what they're going to think, because that's what we think about ourselves.
So how do you work around that? I mean, if you're constantly anxious and worried about yourself, how do you take that step to get out of it?
Yeah. That relationship with your body is less about how your body looks, it's how you feel about your body. And I really like and kind of favour like a body neutral approach, the whole like body neutrality, which is this middle way, because people who don't love their bodies and try this kind of to go down the body positivity route, which has done wonders, I think, for, you know, the conversations around body image, and they can then kind of almost false negative themselves because they then feel bad for the fact that they don't love their bodies, but they're trying to make themselves love their bodies and celebrate everything about them. Whereas the body neutral kind of approach is about respect and awareness and treating your body for like what it can do. And it's almost kind of not thinking about your body so much, but a real focus, particularly in the conversation around sex, is around sensation and pleasure and how your body feels rather than how it looks, because how it looks and how it appears is a preoccupation which is very cognitive. And we don't want to be that cognitive in sex. We want to be kind of much more
free, relaxed, flowing.
Well, much more physical, much more kind of mindful in a, not kind of in a super kind of mindful, like relaxed, you know, meditative state, but in a just giving yourself permission to kind of feel what's happening in the now and to go with that.
Let's talk about like orgasms, because you mentioned something early on about when I said complex and you said it's not complex. And I read in your book about the orgasm gap.
Yeah.
And this is quite a big problem. It's not a problem, but it's something that definitely comes up in my relationship. The stats are 95% of the men usually orgasm, and 65% of women don't orgasm. They do orgasm. So to get a woman to get to orgasm, I'm losing my words here. It takes a lot more time. And you have to pleasure the woman, and there's normally outer penetration, all those type of things. And for men, it's a lot quicker and easier. So for men to approach a woman to have sex, you know they've got to put in the effort for the woman. And to do that regularly can be quite tricky. So that sort of balance, I guess.
Oh, there's a real mix of experiences and myths and things in there that I'd love to unpack. So the orgasm gap, firstly, is a very well documented kind of set of statistics, was kind of primarily researched by someone called Dr. Laurie Mintz, which showed that in heterosexual sexual experiences, that men are orgasming over kind of 95% of the time, and their female partners are reporting orgasming about 65%. There's about a 30% gap. And that gap disappears when women are masturbating. So what we're seeing is like the gap is not consistent across all conditions. And what this gap is kind of showing us is that when we focus on penetrative sex, which is the most common way that men and people with penises orgasm, that is not matching up with how women and people with vulvas most commonly orgasm. And that is where this gap is coming from, because if you said to most people, oh, like, what do you mean by sex? They'd probably tell you, like, oh, like,
what you see on TV.
Penis and vagina penetration, intercourse.
Yeah.
Like, and that also is very heteronormative for a start, but it's that, and again, we're back to the reproduction education kind of part of the conversation. And so if we all hold that as a model of what sex is, and that's where the focus is, and we kind of continue to work on that, what we find is that then that's why that female orgasm gap gets maintained. And the clitoris is not best stimulated through penetrative sex. Now, obviously it can be, and lots of people have worked out how to make it work for them. But with the focus kind of always having been on that part of sex, that's where this gap exists. But anatomically, the penis and the clitoris come from the same structure in the womb, and they are very similar, actually. But so technically, anatomically, female orgasm is not more difficult, but socially, we believe that it is.
Okay.
And so we have this message that female orgasm is much more complex, that it takes more work, etc. But it doesn't. But if everybody believes that, then what it does mean is that people are less likely to try and change it, that a lot of people accept that it's not happening or accept that it's not working. And what we actually know is that when we meet what we call like the good conditions for sex, which is psychological arousal, physical stimulation, and being in the moment, is that if you work out how to make those things work for you, that actually you're much more likely to kind of be able to get yourselves to that point, because orgasm is a peak pleasure experience.
Yeah.
But if your partner's touching you, but your head is, you know, in a completely different place, you're thinking about all the things that you've got to do for work the next day, your phone is buzzing on your bedside table, and your partner isn't touching you in quite the right way, but you don't want to tell them because you think they're having a good time and you don't want to disappoint them. And so A, you're distracted, B, it's not quite the right type of physical stimulation, C, you don't want to disappoint them, and, you know, you're not in like that kind of lineup of where you want to be.
Are there people that can't orgasm?
Mm-hmm.
Are there? Is that just a genetic thing that's going on? Is it?
Well, if we think of orgasm as a learned experience, we have to kind of work out how to do it and how to make it work for us. Now, I'm sure there are people who are not able to for some kind of medical reason or structural reason. It's not something I've seen kind of well documented.
Of course, yeah. I didn't think about, you know, some people that lose, like, they can't use their limbs from the waist down.
Yeah, obviously, like people when they have like levels of paralysis or spinal cord injuries, things like that. You know, if someone has gone through something medical or they've had some kind of surgical procedure, of course, you know, we've obviously got female genital mutilation, but you know, of course, it is a combination of, you know, brain, spinal cord, nervous system, body process, but also psychology. But a lot of people might not be able to orgasm or feel that they've never known how to orgasm, how to make it work for them. And that means that they haven't learned the right way for themselves yet. But if we are hugely shamed or believe this is not something we should be doing, not something we should be using our bodies for, or that, you know, sex is only for a kind of certain experience at a certain time, of course, that's not going to be something that we feel open to trying. Or
So like in a religious setting almost.
Yeah, perhaps, or not even like just religion, you know, just really strict messages about sex or really, you know, strong beliefs about sex.
And
or
some
about
people can be asexual sex. And just not be interested, really.
Yeah, asexuality is an identity in itself, which is characterized by little or no interest in sex. So that kind of comes under something different, but also that's different to kind of how someone might experience pleasure.
I wanted to just circle all of that into my question. Yeah, so that's just, you know, a lot of the time the male would want to have the quick sex session and the female, you know, wouldn't want. It's almost like she's doing it for you. And that's sort of...
I don't know. I'm going to challenge you. I don't know about that.
So what do you mean by it?
Well, I think all people like all different types of sex. I think that there isn't like a timer on it. Like, you know, for some people they are able to orgasm really quickly. I think it's about that alignment of how we think, how we feel, and feel kind of how we think about it, how we feel emotionally, but also how we feel physically.
Yeah.
The relationship we have with our body. We talk about a model of sexual response, and the basic way to kind of describe it, it's a bit like brakes and accelerators. So this is called the sexual response model. And some people have really sensitive accelerators. It's very easy for them to get turned on. They can, but they're pretty uninhibited. It doesn't take much touch or much thought, or they're just someone who finds it very easy to kind of put the foot on the accelerator. Now, when we think about the brakes, that could be something like anxiety. It could be something like worries. It could be something like, I can hear that there's someone downstairs. The feelings I have about my body, or I've got a train to catch, you know, whatever those are.
Yeah.
But if we think about this as a model, and, you know, something I've written about in the book, it's this, okay, some people might have really sensitive brakes, so it's very easy for them to turn off. So they might be kind of starting something with their partner, and they hear a knock at the door, and it's enough to kind of take them out of the moment really quickly, and they struggle to kind of get back into it, or something feels painful, or they start to think they're someone who has a propensity for overthinking, and they start to think, they're like, oh, it's taking a bit longer than usual, maybe it's because I'm not good, like, what's going on? And the thoughts kind of keep spiraling. So if we think about this, some people can have sensitive brakes or sensitive accelerators, or the other way, and so you have to take off the brake to put on the accelerator. So if you find it really hard to take your brakes off, so this is where something often reported with people, for example, with like ADHD, then it can feel really hard to kind of take the brakes off, but you might feel like you're kind of trying to push on your accelerator, but you're just not quite getting there. And it can be a useful model sometimes, and there's lots of stuff online, like documentation, which can help you to work out what your brakes and accelerators are as well. So if for you, you know, having like a quickie might feel more exciting, and that's kind of pushing on your accelerator, but for your partner, it's absolutely slamming on their brakes because all they're thinking is, I've got so many things to do, and then we're going to be late for the train, and being late makes me really stressed, and actually that's just
It is quite a nice
not
way to think
working
about
for
it.
them.
Yeah. It's interesting because it all really comes down to communication with your partner and understanding how you guys both feel sexually and like what you enjoy. So I just want to bring it all together, and you know, I've read the book, it's amazing, but if you had to sort of, it's quite tough to bring something so broad into one message. But what really are you trying to achieve with producing a book like this? You know, what are you trying to get out there to the people?
The book for me it's sex education for adults, essentially. I think so many of us feel like we didn't get the sex education that we wanted, and we didn't get the sex education that we needed. And we feel that is in some way kind of stunted us sexually, or is a huge barrier to us getting what we want sexually as an adult. And I would like people who want to change that for themselves to feel like they know where to start. And the book is something like over 120 questions about sex, everything from the biological, so it's what we call biopsychosocial, so biological and physical, psychological, and thoughts, feelings, etc., and the social elements, so social messaging about sex. It brings all of that together, which is how I frame all of my therapeutic work. And it's over 100 of the questions about the kind of biology, psychology, and social parts of sex, answered with stats and statistics, same thing, with stats, research, papers.
Yeah.
And I would like to feel like people can pick it up as the first kind of step, because you can pick it up. Every page is quite simply a question and an answer.
Yeah.
You can kind of pick something up from every page, pick it up, put it down. You know, you've got one answer per question. If you don't want to read that page, don't read it. If it's not for you, don't read it. But I hope will start people to start thinking about perspectives and opening up their perspective, and then knowing what they want to do further, because what good sex looks like for you is only you are going to know that. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, and definitely for the people listening, I would say that the simplicity of it, like you say, there is data and stats, and so it's informative, but it's also so simple. And I think that's trying to create the image of sex, having this complexity feel about it, bring it down to a more simplistic manner, and just make it a regular conversation.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to put it. Well, good. Thank you so much. I see they're shouting at us. That wasn't long enough. I could have kept going for so long. But thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you, and that was super interesting. Thank you. All good.